Today, it is my distinct honor to be speaking with Peter Richerson and Robert Boyd. They are two anthropologists widely regarded as the co-founders of the field of cultural evolution. And they've made probably the most significant augmentation to Darwinian evolution since the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, which merged Darwinian evolution and Mendelian genetics. So it's really special to speak with them today. And in fact, it's actually a triple honor because I think this is also, we were speaking beforehand, but I think this is your first ever podcast interview, maybe even your first ever joint interview.
I think that's right.
Yep.
So Pete and Rob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
So first question, the oldest tools we've found are about 2.6 million years old, the Oldowan tools. And
yeah, some people think about 3.1 or 3.3.
3.3 at Lomequi.
For the Oldowan tools?
They're not Oldowan. They're even simpler than Oldowan tools.
Interesting.
They were probably made by the way Kanzi made tools, by flinging stones at a hard surface and
Picking up the sharp
the sharp flakes and using the flakes.
Right. Napping.
No, not napping in the sense that napping involves using two hands to knock off. You hold the core in one hand and knock off flakes.
Yeah.
That's an older one.
There's a term for this, for flinging, and I forget what it is. But
So even simpler than
even
napping.
simpler, and they're huge. The cores are huge. I mean,
Right.
they're like 2.5 feet across. And there was some controversy originally about whether they had the dates right because of geological considerations at the site. But now I think pretty much everyone agrees that there are tools there at 3.3, and there are bones with cut marks just a few kilometers away,
Right.
at another site in Ethiopia. And so 3.3.
3.3.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I didn't know we'd found evidence of tools from that long ago.
Yeah.
But I did certainly know about those cut marks. So they found cut and scrape marks on the bones of bovid and an ungulate in this site in Ethiopia.
Yeah, at Gona.
Right. So something was using a tool to cut flesh from bones 3.4 million years ago.
Right.
We also know from fossils found about 3.2 million years ago that australopiths had evolved precision grip in their hands. So clearly something was applying selection pressure on their hands to become more dexterous. So my first, substantive question is, how likely is it that cumulative cultural evolution was already underway with australopithecines?
There is, I just read a paper, I forget the authors, they decided, it seemed kind of arbitrary to me, that it takes, if cumulative culture, the signature of it is more than 6 steps in the manufacture of a tool. Now, why 6 rather than 2? I don't know. It wasn't convincing to me, but so there's, by their count, there by the olden one times or later even, the tools were too simple to. There's something that somebody could reinvent for themselves. That's the argument. Now, I'm not sure I quite believe it, but so that's a kind of approach that people are taking to trying to find a signature for cumulative culture. Go ahead.
The other bit of evidence. So I think it's a mistake to think of cumulative culture as either there or not there. I mean, when the psychology evolved, presumably there's a bunch of steps. And so it's a fact that there are lots of Australopithecine sites with no cut marks and no tools and Australopithecine fossils. So one model you could have that fits the data is there was some kind of psychology that let little bubbles of of technology evolve, and then they would persist for some period of time, and then they'd be lost. And lots of models have that property. If the error rate of learning is high enough, you can easily go backwards. And
maybe that technology was only useful in certain habitats
that's the
for
other
certain
hypothesis.
things,
Yeah,
and that's also possible. I mean, we know that chimpanzees and other tool-making animals sometimes have 2 or 3 or more steps involved in making the tool. So it's by my way of thinking, it's just a continuum, and great apes are pretty smart. Australopithecines must have been pretty smart, and they probably made all sorts of tools that leave no record. And so we don't have the stone tools are sort of like looking at the cumulative culture record through a keyhole. They're wonderful things because stone is so durable, but they're a tiny window into probably what they were doing, just to look at chimpanzees and other tool-making modern creatures. And as you say, the hands of Australopithecines became rather modern-looking. So to me, it's a big mystery what most Australopithecines were doing with. As Rob said, most of them weren't making any tools that we recover
tools.
anyway.
Like stone tools.
Exactly. So what were they doing with those hands?
The chimps make all kinds of stuff. And,
right.
And
they don't have hands that are really well adapted to making things like stone tools.
And when you get to early Homo, so that's say 2 million years ago, 1.8 million years ago or something like that, then you never find fossils without stone tools. So there's a difference between the Australopithecine archaeological record and early Homo erectus, depending on how you want to. It's unclear how to categorize all those fossils, but
So what were Australopithecines doing with their hands?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, pretty clearly, at least sometimes they were using them to make tools, but they might have been using them to carry things. Rob had this idea a long time ago that Australopithecines are, small, not very fast, out in fairly open countries. So what they might have been doing is going around in big mobs, carrying sticks and stones to defend themselves against lions and giant hyenas and the other nasty predators were out there. There's Carl Butzer has an old book in which he has a plate in it of a drawing of a chimpanzee with a great big rock. A chimpanzee, an Australopithecine with a great big rock threatening to chuck it at something.
There is this idea about throwing. So what's that guy's name at Stony Brook?
The stone throwing hypothesis.
Yeah, exactly. My proper noun module is failing on me, but people like Leslie Aiello and people who know the anatomy will tell you that the shoulder and back has been reorganized by early Homo and maybe Australopithecines for the purposes of
throwing, overarm
throwing, and there's lots of, you can tell lots of stories. We don't know, but I often thought, when I was a young lad, we had rock throwing wars. We would get out. There was this pond near my parents' house, and different groups of kids start throwing rocks at each other, and you can really get hurt with a sizable cobble. And if I were trying to scavenge from lions or hyenas, throwing rocks at them would be a good strategy because, they don't want to come chase you away because they want to stay there eating. And there's a big free rider problem, and you could stand off and make trouble for them. But, just who knows?
So, Pete, you mentioned somebody has this argument that it's unlikely australopithecines had achieved cumulative cultural evolution because the tools that we can conclusively connect to them are things that seemingly could be created in the lifetime of one individual. So individual learning is kind of sufficient to explain those innovations.
Or at least it's at the margin. Yeah.
At the margin. So my rebuttal to that, if I wanted to take the other side of that argument, would be, sure, but their brains were much smaller than early human brains. Their brains were only a little bit larger than that of a chimpanzee. And so perhaps those tools weren't cultural creations that could be devised in the space of an individual lifetime for an individual with a brain of that size. What would you make of that rebuttal?
It's quite possible, it seems to me. And also there's a kind of a quantitative, maybe 1 in 100 australopithecines would invent a particular tool, but the other 99% of them got it from cultural transmission or from mom, or
but no accumulation.
But not much accumulation at any rate. So it just seems to me that we'd expect this to evolve gradually, and there wouldn't be any cut point we put it on cumulative culture be a bit arbitrary. So that's my picture of it, is that as the brains got bigger, more information processing was possible. And of course, that would also mean that Homo erectus was probably more inventive. They could probably master things individually that an australopithecine, the average australopithecine at least, might depend upon acquiring culturally.
Yeah, and their brains were, depends who's doing the estimating, but about 30% bigger corrected for body size than chimps.
Right.
But they show no trend. So australopithecine encephalization is completely flat from 3.5 million years ago to 2 million years ago. And as soon as you get to early Homo,
you start to
there's quite a steep slope. So by 1 million years ago, you got creatures with brains, 1,000 cc's, 1,100 cc's, something like that. So, so something happened at the transition between australopithecines and early Homo, which early Homo is a real mixed bag. There are little tiny ones that are sort of australopithecine size, and there's big ones, and it's not completely clear what was going on, in terms of one species, several species. That's all up in the air right now.
Yeah.
One of the things that is a potential causal factor is the onset of the Pleistocene climate fluctuations. We still don't have any high-resolution data from between 3 and 1.5 million. There's just a recent paper that reports a core that's 1.5 million years old. And it's pretty clear that the millennial and submillennial scale variation is present in the 1.5 million years ago, but it's gotten more intense across the whole Pleistocene, or at least the last 2/3 or 3/4 of the Pleistocene. And we don't know anything about the high frequency variation before the onset of the Pleistocene.
In the Pleistocene.
So there's a big gap in our knowledge at that critical period when the transition occurred. But at least my speculation is that it was the onset of that millennial and submillennial scale variation that started to push the encephalization.
It's such a fascinating speculation. I want to come back to that, and I have a few questions on that. But before we do, a couple of other things first. So I wanted to test an intuition with you. Sometimes you hear people talk about the prospect of chimp scientists and whether cumulative cultural evolution could allow the possibility of having like chimp or australopith scientists. But my understanding of the way the process works is that is not how it would play out, because as soon as the autocatalytic feedback loop of social learning to cumulative cultural evolution spins into motion, that puts selection pressure on brains to grow larger. And then by the time whatever the creature was has evolved into being a scientist, the species is no longer what it originally was, whether that was a chimp or an australopith, whatever. Is that a correct?
Science. So, I mean, science as we know it is only a few hundred years old.
Yeah, I guess
it's a particular.
That's a high standard. That's a high standard.
I mean, it's a particular social institution,
right?
That has a bunch of rules about credit and priority and other things that generated, the world we live in, basically. But before that, there are people doing experiments and, cumulative culture all the way back. So that's what you mean by science. You mean the more...
Could you have a creature with a small brain of like 400 centimeters cubed, like a chimp or an australopithecine, that because it evolves cultural learning, it can simultaneously be a small-brained hominid and evolve some kind of cultural complex as intricate as the scientific method? And I guess the intuition I had was that those things aren't compatible, because by the time it evolves the intricate cultural complex, it's already a different species because of the pressure that feedback loop would place on its brain size.
Yeah.
So do you know the argument of this South African student of tracking, Louis Lieberman?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
so
he'd be a great guy to interview.
Yeah, he'd be. I don't know him. I don't know.
I've had some. Yeah, go ahead.
Anyhow, he studied tracking by the Kalahari San people, and he argues that the roots of science are in the kinds of practices that they have. So usually it's 2, 3, 4 guys tracking an animal, and the signs are very ambiguous and slight. Bent grass blades and a strike of a hoof here, and a bent twig where something brushed past a bush or something like that. And so these guys are talking to one another all the time, and their natural history knowledge is quite good, very good. And so they know the animal that they're tracking. They know what species it is. They know how it moves and what it's likely to do. And so they're using that background knowledge to generate hypotheses about what this particular animal is doing right now. And they are using this to reach a decision about, do we continue to pursue this animal? If they're tracking it, they don't have it in visual, they don't have it in sight. So they're depending upon these thin clues to try to infer what it's doing. Now, if they think it's wounded or old, or then they might continue this pursuit for quite some time,
days,
even.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, if they think it's a perfectly healthy animal and can run 4 times as fast as they can, they say, give up on this one. We'll never catch it. So they're prepared to spend a huge amount of effort if they think they've got a reasonable chance of success, but not otherwise. And so, they're just talking it out as they're running along, looking at one sign after another. And so this, he thinks, is, and the big thing is that the background knowledge. They've got a theory about what this animal might be doing, and so they're testing that theory with this rather skimpy evidence that they're running across. And
so they're using a form of like deductive inference.
It's a scientific method, kind of
in the
on
field,
the fly, out in the bush chasing, wildebeest or something. They hunt with these little low-powered bows, tiny little 40, 50-pound full bows, and poisoned arrows. So they often have to track animals that are dying from the poison for long periods, for hours and hours. And so it's a big part of their hunting strategy. It's not like other people, have bows that kill the animal on the spot, but not the not the Hudson, not the Kung. Actually, it's not the Kung. It's Central Kalahari people.
I can't remember the name of the group.
I can't pronounce it. Exclamation point XO. And if you
Show ho ho,
but we need Polly.
That's so interesting. So, okay, last point for now on the kind of history of early humans, but what's your kind of lower bound for when cumulative cultural evolution was achieved in our lineage? Like, when can we say with some certainty that it's
for sure
clear in the record?
300 to 500,000 years ago.
Middle Paleolithic.
Middle Paleolithic.
Yeah.
You get prepared core tools and lots of evidence, I think, of people know how to make fire.
Yeah. And this is with Homo erectus?
No, this is...
A little later than that, probably.
Is, who this is, you can get in fights about what to call them, but these are these robust, so sometimes people call them archaics. So proto-Neanderthals, proto-Denisovans.
Right. Is this sometimes called Heidelbergensis?
Yeah, it's
sometimes
one term,
people call it Heidelbergensis. You can in certain circles you can get in a big fight about what to call these guys, but
you're not going to find Rob and I in that fight.
I mean, they were morphologically, they were heavy set compared to us.
Yeah.
They made, they're quite distinctive, but what they were like cognitively, their brains are a little smaller, but not very much. And by the end, they're bigger actually than our brains. And so for sure, if I had to bet, somebody introduces a time machine and makes me bet, I would bet at least 1 million.
At least 1 million?
At least 1 million. But I think the evidence, there's this one site in Israel.
Yesha Gano Yaakov or something?
Yeah, exactly.
That has all the organic remains.
Has organic remains. There's a skeleton of an elephant. They're eating acorns, which
fish,
at least
turtles.
But eating acorns, depending on what kind of acorns they were, that can involve quite a bit of detoxification.
Yeah, you've got to leach them. Or
leach the tannins out of the acorns. Now, there are acorns without
sweet acorns.
So it could be that we don't know for sure. But anyway, it's a site, but it's it's unique. It's this anoxic site that preserved all this stuff. And but I watch guys making hand axes. We have some very skilled nappers in my department, and it looks pretty complicated. I don't think we know actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to break all of my podcast rules by getting you to answer a pretty basic question.
Yeah.
And not only that, but a 3-part question.
Oh my goodness.
So
the audience has to remember 3 parts.
Yeah, exactly. And you guys too. So we don't have to spend too much time on this, but just to give everyone context before we move on, could you briefly outline, firstly, cultural evolution, secondly, cumulative cultural evolution, and thirdly, gene culture coevolution?
Sure.
Okay,
you can tag team if you want.
And you can, like in the wrestling, tag me and you can jump in the ring. But so cultural evolution occurs when an organism gets useful information from other organisms through some kind of social learning process. So I think chimps have cultural evolution. Lots of songbirds do. Lots of animals have some kind of cultural evolution. Cumulative cultural evolution occurs when the process is sufficiently faithful or accurate, the social learning process, so that some individual invents something, and then some other individual learns enough about what that individual made and now changes it, and other individuals can learn the new variant. So lots of social learning processes don't involve the transmission of variation within a population. You just get, that's a great story. Should I tell it? So Hans Kummer was a very famous primatologist, and he had a cat colony outside of Zurich, and there were crab apples along the outside of the cage, and the crab apples would drop, and the monkeys were very interested in these crab apples. And one of the monkeys learned to get a stick to drag the crab apples into the cage and eat them. This attracted a lot of attention, and monkeys got very interested in sticks. So this is what's called stimulus enhancement.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the sticks were associated with something that monkeys really wanted, the crab apples, made them, but no other monkey could put it together and look at the first monkey use the stick and drag it back.
This is a really rudimentary form of social learning.
What's called stimulus enhancement. It's really common in non-human animals.
Probably common enough in humans.
It's common in humans too, right? But the thing is that unless I see, so you've innovated something, unless I can copy that innovation, not the fact that you use sticks or the fact that there's crab apples to eat, but the fact that you did a particular thing, that's what you need for accumulation. Because now somebody else makes another improvement, somebody else makes another improvement.
Somebody makes a stick into a rake.
Yeah, and you end up with something that's beyond the inventive capacity of individuals. There's a very colorful psychologist, Claudio Teni, who has studied this a lot, and he calls it the zone of latent solutions. So the zone of latent solutions is that space of behaviors that individuals can generate based on the behavior in their lives with some social input. Sticks are important. But humans are able to get the details or the variants that somebody else invents. And that leads to accumulation. And gene culture coevolution happens anytime culture of either kind changes the selective regime so that gene variants that weren't favored when in the acultural, non-cultural species are now favored. So, and that doesn't have to be due to cumulative cultural evolution. So
there are migratory ungulates that have to learn their migratory patterns by some form of social learning. And there are these natural experiments where some migratory route has been stopped for some reason. Somebody built a fence, and then the fence gets torn down. And it takes them a few generations to recover their original migratory pattern. So this is something that's very important to their lives, and yet it's still a very simple form of culture. How far do you migrate? When do you do it?
Domain specific.
Rather domain specific.
Right.
And then it seems to me that gene culture coevolution comes in two flavors. One, originally pointed out by E.O. Wilson, is that culture puts pressure on genes to control the cultural evolution, to influence cultural evolution so that it increases genetic fitness. And then there is, I think of it as culture-led gene culture coevolution, where the cultural variation is impressed on the genes because the cultural environment generates selection on the genes that favors the cultural system. I think of modern penal institutions have this effect. That if you're incarcerated, you're less likely to reproduce. So I think of chimpanzees as basically a society of psychopaths, and in humans we've got psychopathy down to a low roar. Something like 2 or 3% of humans are clinically diagnosed as psychopathic. And that's because I think for hundreds of thousands of years, if not longer, we have punished people who don't cooperate and rewarded people who do cooperate. And this has transformed our social psychology. The difference between chimps and humans is that humans are adapted to make massive use of cultural adaptations. And to do that, you need to have large societies. And one of the ways that we mobilize a lot two things I think are critical to mobilizing resources. One is technology and the other is social organization. So we make a lot of profit out of being able to cooperate in ways that our competitors can't.
Yeah.
And on a much sort of more simple scale, a big fraction of the new genes that have been, so you can identify genes that have been under selection by looking for long haplotypes that show evidence of a gene being favored by selection and carrying a bunch of the lateral genes along with it.
Yeah.
Linked
genes. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of linked genes. And if there's some highly favored gene, it drags a bunch of linked genes with it. And by looking for those long segments of chromosomes, you can tell which genes were under selection.
And how long ago.
And a lot of the ones that have been under recent selection, last 10,000 years, are genes that the cultural evolution of farming and urban life created the new selection environment. So genes for dealing with starches, genes for dealing with pathogens that are characteristic of village rather than hunter-gatherer life and stuff like that. It's like 2/3 of the genes that have been under recent strong selection are ones that are plausibly related to environmental changes that were culturally evolved.
That's really interesting because so often I'll hear cultural evolutionists make a claim like, ever since our species crossed the Rubicon into cumulative cultural evolution, maybe that was 1 million years ago or whenever.
Yeah.
Ever since that point, the culture we've accumulated has become the main selection pressure on our genes. But my question was how is that statement actually quantified or quantifiable? But maybe that suggests a way that you could.
Yeah, but so we can't detect selection. Well, there are ways, but recent selection is a lot easier to detect than selection 50,000 years ago. And that's just because recombination breaks up all these long haplotypes. And
haplotypes are reduced to...
You can't see them. There are other methods, but they're much less reliable, I think. So it could be that in spreading across the world 60,000 years ago, there was lots of selection for all kinds of stuff, but we have a hard time seeing it, detecting it with genomic methods. I mean, I think almost certainly moving from the Horn of Africa to the high Arctic must have selected for some stuff, right? I mean,
well, there are the morphological differences.
Yeah, and cold adaptations.
Cold adaptations. The high altitude adaptations is another good story. But who knows how much historical information the geneticists will eventually be able to extract. The innovations have been spectacular in ancient DNA, for example, spectacular innovations in the last few decades.
If we had populations of ancient DNA, which is not out of the realm of possibility, then we could do long haplotypes with aDNA. So
I'm aware of that study Kevin Lalland and a few others did a few years ago where I think they found over 100, maybe it's more now, but they'd found over 100 genes that plausibly had been shaped by or selected by culture.
Yeah.
Just to quickly go back to the definition of cultural evolution, how much loss would there need to be in transmission before you said, okay, that's no longer an evolutionary process?
I mean, that depends, right? So in experiments, so there's a lovely experiment by a young cognitive scientist at Berkeley, Bill Thompson. And so he had people learn to do a sorting algorithm. And then he offered them in one treatment there are 3 treatments. One, they had to do on their own. Only a few people figured it out, a few percent, 10% or something. And then they had social learning. They could see other people. And then he gave them social learning plus the payoffs that the individuals who solved, how everybody's payoff, depending on what algorithm they used. And the error rate in that experiment was about 50%. So 50% of the people who copied, because he knows who copies who, but from the way the experiment was run, failed to get it right. But if they were given the payoff information, the best algorithm spread throughout the whole population because the flow of information in was high enough to compensate for this very high error rate.
Mutation rate. So
Whereas if you didn't get payoff information, the best algorithm just percolated along at what the invention rate was. And
so people could use the success rate of others as a basis for biasing their...
And they just completely focused on the people who had the best algorithm. And then that whole process. So I don't think it's just the accuracy. You have to look at the processes that are degrading information as it's transmitted through time, and then processes that are increasing the quality of information.
Yeah.
So it's just a kind of a budget problem.
I don't
in-go and outgo, and the sort of equilibrium depends upon the relative rates of those two things.
Yeah, I think you've got cumulative cultural evolution when things get better through time. Now, obviously, once everybody's learned the good algorithm, they're going to stop getting better, but it'll reach some steady state. But if the potential is there for gradual improvement over generations, then I count that as cumulative cultural evolution.
Yeah. Interesting. So back to gene culture coevolution.
Yeah.
Are there any particularly surprising or counterintuitive examples of gene culture coevolution? I think the one that fascinates me the most is that the sclera of our eyes have probably evolved to aid with teaching, because you can track the gaze of someone who's teaching you if you can see the whites of their eyes. And I guess it helps with social referencing and infants as well. But are there any other examples that I know the canonical...
Why do you find that counterintuitive?
Not counterintuitive, but just surprising or kind of fascinating.
One of my favorite examples, it's a little bit peculiar, but Japanese people eat seaweed in fairly large part of their diet. And it's not human genes that change, but they harbor a bacterium in their gut that degrades the polysaccharides in seaweed. And I mean, this gut flora that we have is a whole ecosystem that is presumably co-evolving with our genes and with our diets, and obviously diets are culturally determined in large part. So that's a whole other field of coevolution. If you want, we've got this giant domesticated ecosystem in our guts.
But that hasn't genetically evolved. That's like downloaded through culture, approximately.
Well, who knows? In other words, there's people in Japan are eating these seaweeds with polysaccharides that humans can't digest very well, and is it they just acquire a wild bacterium that happens to have this capacity, or has a capacity evolved in human guts? I don't know. I don't imagine anybody does, but it's another whole dynamic system that involves gene culture coevolution, not human genes. And I suppose it's a lot like domestic animals. So there's a whole nother domestic plants and animals are a whole nother coevolutionary process that involves human artificial selection. Now, it's not deliberate selection in our gut, I don't suppose, but
Most domestication isn't either.
So
the Siberian fox experiment's probably the classic example there, right? In maybe 40 generations.
Yeah,
no, way fewer. They got them.
There's a bunch of controversy about that now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What's the source of the controversy?
Well, the story is that Vavilov, is that his name?
No, Vavilov was a plant guy. What is, I can't remember.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. They were just selecting they had one selection criteria, which was flight distance, basically, people would approach and how close would they let people get. And that they started with wild foxes. And there's been a bunch of stuff recently saying neither of those things is really true, that there'd been a lot of domestication of these foxes already. And I haven't kept up with that carefully, but I mean, we know that, dogs and cats and cows and pigs, there's been lots of domestication, and mainly by Stone Age farmers who weren't trying to domesticate anything, right? They were just keeping the ones they liked. And so,
a friend of mine, his father was a superintendent of the National Bison Range in Montana or Wyoming. And he grew up on this federal facility that was trying to propagate bison for release in the wild back in the 40s and 50s when they were trying to build up the herds. And they came to find out they used basically cowboys and the same kind of techniques that you use to deal with cattle, to deal with bison. The only problem is that the bison are just wilder than can be compared to a cow. So they discovered that they were inadvertently domesticating the bison because particularly the bulls, a lot of them were really, really scary. And they broke out of fences, they squashed cowboys, and so those are the ones that somehow ended up at the butcher more often than the tamer ones. And so they were trying to, maintain the wild type because they wanted to release them into the wild, and ability to deal with predators would have been a desirable characteristic, but their ability to deal badly with cowboys was costing them their lives. So that's a domestication story that I find it fascinating.
Yeah.
It's hard not to when you're dealing with wild animals, it's hard not to inadvertently select them for traits that make it easy to deal with them, at least, if not other things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so I promised we'd come back to Pleistocene climate variation.
Mm-hmm.
So this is both fascinating and crucial for the mathematical models you guys developed in the 70s and 80s. They were, I guess, most famously published in the 85 book, Culture and the Evolutionary Process. I've learned a lot about Pleistocene climate variation through reading your work. So you had these macro cycles in the first 1.5 million years. Those cycles lasted for about 41,000 years. In the last
41,000, so 23,000 years was a dominant cycle before the Pleistocene.
Yeah,
and then the Pleistocene transition brought on the dominance of the 41,000 year cycle, and then in the middle of the Pleistocene, by about 800,000 years ago, the 100,000 year cycle became clearly dominant.
Yeah. And then superimposed on those macro cycles, you had these shorter cycles. And this is so interesting. I didn't realize that every, say, 1,000 or so years in the shorter cycles, in what we know as the ice ages, like the last ice age, the temperature could actually go from glacial to interglacial. over like almost
Not
interglacial,
quite,
not quite.
yeah.
But so, I mean, what we think of as ice ages were actually interspersed with like quite warm periods. So
Yeah.
a huge amount of variation. But I have a bunch of questions about this. But before we get to those, could you just paint a picture of what that would have been like on the ground in terms of the temperature, the rainfall in Africa, and then the variation in those dimensions?
Yeah, my picture of it is it was just completely chaotic. The original paleontologists and paleobotanists that looked at this, they called them anomalous distributions. So they would find things like reindeer and bison and horses in the same fossil beds. Now, whether these were exactly contemporaneous or not, it's hard to say, but with those millennial and submillennial scale, high amplitude submillennial and millennial scale variation, the vegetation and the rest of the ecology couldn't come to any kind of equilibrium insofar as there was ever any equilibrium. So when the transition to the Holocene occurred and the climate got very much quieter, it took a couple of 3,000 years before we got the modern biomes organized. So the boreal forest and the tundra and the steppe, these stripes. So the term of art was plaid versus striped patterns. And so the Pleistocene, the last ice age, it seems at least, was just hugely chaotic, particularly the last half of it.
But it's fair to say that the cold periods are drier, right?
Well, and I mean, a bunch of things.
He's the expert on this.
Well, I'm an advanced amateur at best. But so the picture of it is, everything was colder on average, drier on average, and of course less CO2, which impacts plant growth rates. So it was just wildly varying system on a fairly short time scale.
Yeah, really short time scale.
And that impacted humans. Now, what the last ice age, of course, was the first place that this was discovered. Well, Rob and I talked about saying something about this in the 85 book, and Rob talked me out of it because the data was lousy. There just wasn't a decent high resolution record that resolved these millennial and submillennial scale variations until, the publications are in the early 90s. The ice cores from Greenland were raised in the latest 80s, and then it took a few years to get the data analyzed. And so in 92, 93, this data came out. And I thought we couldn't ask for better data than that. It was just what the model
amazing
suggested
vindication
should be happening. Yeah. So we were, maybe we should, in retrospect, we should have been bolder. We should have predicted the millennial and submillennial scale variations on the grounds that the humans wouldn't have evolved without them. But
what gave you, because that data, as you said, didn't come out till the mid-90s, what gave you the hunch?
Well, there were cores drilled in Greenland, mostly along the edge of the ice, because logistically, to get out on the ice divide in the middle of the Greenland ice sheet is a logistical big project. And so the Europeans and the Americans in the late 80s organized the resources to go out there and drill those 2-mile-long cores down through. So they drill on the ice divide, so that on the ice divide, the ice is not moving horizontally. It's just the layers are getting thinner and thinner as you go down. But away from the ice divide, it's basically turbulent. The ice is flowing and it's overturning and mixing up as it goes along. So by the time you get to the ice margin, the record is lousy.
Right.
But it did seem to show, a few cores did seem to show these big excursions. But it was, as I say, it was not the kind of data that would convince a skeptic at all.
And also, you always argued that there is these, variance propagation from the fluid guys have from long time scales to shorter time scales. And we knew that there was much more variation on 100,000 year time scales than there ever had been before. And so it seemed plausible that, Pete talked me into it,
there are these so-called variance cascades that I learned about this because I collaborated with physical environmental sciences to get tenure, basically. And so they taught me a bunch of stuff that I would never otherwise have learned. But so in the turbulent motions in the ocean, there's a huge amount of energy in the major currents, like the California current off our coast here, and that energy then it forms eddies that break down, and so and ultimately at the bottom at small scales, at centimeter scales, friction absorbs all of that energy that's being put into the ocean basically by the wind. And so that there's a quite orderly cascade of variance from low frequencies to high frequencies. And so you could imagine the same thing occurring on these 100,000 year timescales, that there'd be a variance cascade that would affect the higher frequencies. But it's a metaphorical argument. It's not real. You're a physicist. It wasn't really a mechanistic argument.
No,
it was an analogy, if you want. But
it turned out to be right.
Turned out to be right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
in a big way. So explain how culture is an adaptation to this climate variation.
Well, so the culture evolves faster than genes. That's the basic starting point of the argument. On the other hand, culture seems to require this massive, at least the kind of culture we have, cumulative culture, that requires this massive brain that's extremely costly in metabolic terms, and your head's fragile. It could easily get hurt. Some people even think that insanity comes from having too big a brain. It gets confused sometimes. So there are these major costs to having this system of cumulative culture. And so the question that Rob and I posed in our 85 book is, what could this thing be good for? I mean, the way I phrase it in talks or to students is, the dinosaurs had it right. You should have as small a brain as you can get away with. It's too expensive to mess around with big brains unless they're doing some real work for you. So what could the real work be?
Brain tissue is like 20 times more energetically expensive than muscle tissue.
Yeah, something on that order. Yeah. And it contributes a lot to basal metabolism. In other words, there's not muscles, if you don't use them, like we're sitting here, we're not, our muscles are just ticking over, but our brain seems to be generating a lot of metabolic activity all the time. And
in your book, Not by Genes Alone, I think you have a statistic about the brain absorbs about 16% of a human's basal metabolic rate, but only about 3% in an average mammal.
Yeah.
That's 5%, I think. I can't remember the exact numbers. 3% in efficient mammals like opossums and the other small-brained
the little
mammals,
ones.
the little brain mammals. So that the question then is how do we pay that overhead cost? And so one thing that will generate that overhead pay that overhead cost is adaptation to spatial and temporal variation. If we can adapt more finely to high frequency variation in time, or adapt more efficiently to spatial variation on a finer scale, then that will, in the models we made in the 85 book, that would be something that would tend to pay that overhead cost.
And especially in sort of multi-generation timescales. So,
yes.
So the thing about ordinary learning will do stuff for you on individual lifetime scales or generational time scales, but it gets lost, right? If you don't have cultural transmission. And a lot of the variance seems to be in these kind of 1,000-year, 100-year timescales, where culture is fast enough to keep up, but preserves things long enough to be useful on those timescales.
Mm. That's so interesting.
So in a sense, then cultural evolution economizes on individual learning. We learn things socially, and the cost of innovation is spread over the whole population.
Right.
Everybody's doing a little bit of innovating and then sharing with the rest of us, and that will pay this overhead cost.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So if the environment is varying slowly enough, be that in space or time,
genes keep up fine.
If it's varying too quickly, the only way to keep up is individual learning.
Right.
Or individual phenotypic flexibility of one kind or another.
Right. But if it's varying in this sweet spot of like a millennial or submillennial scale, then culture is the best way to keep up.
That's our argument. Yes.
That's our story.
That's really interesting.
We're sticking to it.
Actually, there's maybe one other interesting timescale here, which is if it's varying on an extremely quickly timescale, like an hour by hour basis, then that would go back to favoring genetic evolution, right?
Well, I think
it would take like the average.
Oh, well, depends.
Yeah, that might. Yes. So if the temperature of your environment goes up permanently, then but yes, if it's varying on too rapid a time scale, then if you can adapt to the average, I mean, if the temperature were going from freezing to 1,000 degrees on an hourly basis, I don't think anything could manage that. But
right,
if it's something that you can buffer, we have rather large body size, so we can buffer high frequency variations in temperature just because we have a large body size.
But you're thinking about things, I mean, it really has to do with the time scale of individual learning. So, I mean, you think about, our irises adapt to a varying environment on really short time scales because it's a really simple mechanism. Genes have provided us with, a photometer that does that. But if it was about, something else, took several days to learn, then things that vary on an hourly scale were not, then you're right. Then it would just be a genetic adaptation to whatever the average was. And
right.
Or some, as Rob says about irises of eyes, we have a lot of different phenotypic flexibility mechanisms. If you see a bus coming down the sidewalk, you panic and get the hell out of the way. So it doesn't have much to do with culture or individual learning. It's just emergency decisions.
Got it. So I find this functionalist analysis of culture so appealing and interesting. But do you remember how you came up with it? Like, what was the genesis of the idea?
Well, on my part, I was a freshman faculty member, first-year faculty member in this new department. and it was an interdisciplinary department meant to deal with environmental problems. And one of my senior colleagues was a sociologist, and he'd been part of the planning for this new department. And he'd put a course on the books called Principles of Human Ecology. And so then he was designated to teach it, but he decided he needed a natural scientist to help him teach this course. And so I'd worked on a postdoctoral project with him, and so I'd done a certain amount of reading in the social sciences, and I knew that there were these people who call themselves cultural ecologists who talked about cultural adaptations, and so we had decided to make adaptation a central part of this course, and so I went off to find out what these cultural ecologists had to say about how cultural adaptations work. My training in evolutionary biology was fairly adequate. And so I sort of knew where adaptations came from, genetic adaptations came from. So where did cultural adaptations come from? And what these guys, they had the concept of cultural adaptations, but they didn't have the concept of cultural evolution, at least not in anything like the way evolutionary biologists did. Rob and I were teaching a different course together. And so I was bugging him about this, and one thing led to another.
Yeah, and we came upon, it was kind of in the air. There were other people who had kind of related ideas. Don Campbell, Mark Feldman. You introduced us in a way that some people would disagree with, that we aren't the first or the most important. Mark and
Luca
would think of themselves that way. But and I'd read their papers, and I actually don't think they had a theory of cultural adaptation at that point. But
they weren't very interested in
no,
adaptation.
they were anyway. So, and then Pete and I just started talking, and we weren't very. So people like Andrew Vida and
Skip Rappaport
and Marvin Harris,
Julian Stewart.
They had lots of data on cultural adaptation, lots of interesting stuff, but no mechanism that was plausible to us anyway. Mm. And so we just started talking, and out it came.
I think of it as just a sort of Darwinian straight and narrow. We just marched down the same path that the geneticists had in the neo-Darwinian synthesis and the modern synthesis. And
So I want to play a counterfactual. Imagine in the next few years, we get some new data that stretches all the way back into the Pleistocene that shows that climate variation has actually been continually increasing since the Pleistocene right up through the Pleistocene. From your perspective, what's the most important story that would enable us to tell? Would it enable us to tell some kind of grand story about how climate variation has been driving the evolution of brain size and intelligence on Earth? Or
well, I think that what we expect, in other words, doing what Rob and I didn't do in the 85 book, turning the question around and arguing that brain size is a kind of a paleoclimate indicator. In other words, brains are for coping with variable environments on different timescales, culture being, as you say, in the sweet spot. There is a sweet spot for culture. To go even further back, brain size in mammals generally has been increasing for the last 65 million years.
Since the dinosaurs?
Since the dinosaurs, yeah. And birds probably too, but birds don't fossilize very well.
They're lousy for birds.
Because they're so delicate to fly. You have to have light bones, and light bones aren't very rugged, and so the bird record is poor. And the mammal record is quite poor. A guy named Harry Jerrison at UCLA in 1973, his book, I think, used naturally occurring fossil endocasts to build a record of brain size evolution for the last 65, 70 million years. And but it's a really crude record because fossil endocasts aren't very common. And nowadays, somebody could go back and take all the skulls in all of these collections and put them in an X-ray machine and do computerized tomography and develop a much finer resolution set of data. But as I keep looking for this, and so far, nobody that I have run across has actually tried to do this.
It's complicated because the other response to climate variation is to go small. I mean, so apes, there were hundreds of species of apes 20 million years ago. And by 8 or 10 million years ago, most of them were gone and replaced by monkeys. So apes came first and monkeys replaced apes mainly, not completely. So, if you can't predict, then just make a lot of offspring, the kind of invertebrate strategy.
Yeah.
And that's going to be overlaid on top of,
Well, yes. And Jerrison's data, how did he summarize it? Many mammalian lineages got bigger brains, but by no means all of them.
So what's been driving that?
Well,
if it's been happening for 65 million years?
Well, what I think our models suggest is that, and models like them suggest, is that the world has been getting more variable on short timescales. Now, the trouble is that there are no short timescale records that I know of that certainly not to cover the whole last 65 million years. Now, I don't think you need that. You could just have samples. You could look at fossil tree rings or something like that and develop samples of high frequency climate variation, old lake sediments, old marine sediments, and not try to have a complete record, just spot samples.
You'd
So
like
give
to
you
know
some
the
indication.
slope.
What's that?
You'd like to know the slope of the brain size versus time curve, right? Because I think we just know the average.
Well, Jerrison suggested that there was a long, slow, and then the transition from
so that
to
would
the
fit
Pleistocene was with our story.
Miocene, Eocene variation being not that big, warm, wet planet, and then all of a sudden in the late Miocene, things go to hell basically, and it gets colder and drier and more variable, and so until 20 million years ago, there were tropical rainforests in Moscow and
temperate rainforests in Antarctica.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a much more. Now this is of course about primates who are forest specialists, but then all of a sudden, in the Miocene, things dry out. You can't just live in the forest anymore. It's a lot more variation. And if it's true, I didn't know this about Jerrison's data. If there's an acceleration.
Well, again, the crudity of that data might cause some skepticism, but that's what he says.
Yeah, that's what I predict. Okay, so
interesting.
Stick my neck out here.
I like it. That's so interesting. Okay.
There is a great paper that you might look up by a geochemist at UC Santa Barbara and his co-authors. I forget his first name, Zachos, Zachos, 2001 paper in Science, I think. If you have trouble finding it, just drop me an email and I'll give you the full reference.
Right.
But and I don't know how he derived it, but he and his co-authors derived it. But they have in the graph that they have a pattern of dots that are around the mean curve that they use to represent their impression of what the variation in climate has been. They don't specify time scales.
I know this. Yeah, I know
that paper. Yeah, it's
absolutely.
a great paper.
I think the dots are just data points.
I don't know what data they are. I don't think
It's all from deep sea cores. Yeah.
could be. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's
might
all from
be.
deep sea cores.
Hmm.
And what's Pete's going to, the variant, the cloud of points around the mean gets much wider.
As you get to,
As you
and
get toward the
particularly
present.
during the Pleistocene, it just explodes.
Yeah.
But I think this would be the orbital scale variation. If it's real data, it's orbital scale.
I mean, yeah, it's
Milankovitch,
100,000 year.
100,000, 20,000 year, 41,000 year,
Yeah.
23,000 years, the shortest. They aren't real cycles. They're more complicated than that, but they're orbital perturbations that come from the gravitational effect of mainly Jupiter on the Earth. So that to a first approximation, the Earth and the other planets follow these orderly orbits, but under the massive influence of the gravitation of the sun. But Jupiter has enough gravitational force on the other planets to perturb their orbits in a systematic, but not exactly cyclical way.
Oh,
and
wow.
that's where you get the 100,000 year ellipticity and the 41,000 year tilt and the 23,000 year precession of the equinoxes by the gravitational effects. I suppose that Saturn and the other big planets also may have a measurable effect.
I didn't know that we could connect the variation back to
These
orbital perturbations.
But the orbital perturbations then are somehow filtered by the Earth-ocean atmosphere system. So we go, so the 100,000 year, the 41,000 year, and the 23,000 year quasi cycles, they sometimes say, haven't changed as the Earth moved from the Pliocene to the Pleistocene, the early Pleistocene, and then the later Pleistocene. Those orbital scales didn't change. Something about the way the Earth responded to them is what generated the dominance of one cycle versus the other.
Right.
And the just exactly what that all amounts to is at least still a mystery to me. I don't know if it's a mystery to the paleoclimatologists or not, but I think it is. And what generates the millennial and submillennial scale variation, and why has it been increasing over the at least the last 1.5 million years? One hypothesis I saw, speculative, I think, but it's that the North American glacier is sort of the dominant ice mass during the high glacial episodes, and over the successive glacial cycles, it's gradually been planing the North American continent flatter, so it reduces the friction. So the reason that the amplitude and frequency have gone up is because the sliding of the glacier off the North American continent has gotten faster and faster.
That's sort of, for the want to nail the kingdom is lost kind of causation, but it, easily could be.
Yeah, it's a mechanistic hypothesis. Whether it's true or not, I don't. I'm not an expert enough to have a. What do I want to say? I'm not enough of an expert to have an expert opinion.
Yeah, that's fascinating nonetheless. So everything we've spoken about thus far raises the question of contingency. So it seems like, you can correct me if this is inaccurate, but for cultural brains to evolve took at least 3, if you like, exogenous shocks. One was apes becoming bipedal about 5 million years ago. The second was the large amount of predation on the savannas in Africa. I think I read that there was about twice the level of predation there is today, both in terms of the number and the type of predators. And then the third factor is the Pleistocene climate variation we've spoken about. Do you see all of those ingredients as just independent factors and we kind of won the lottery in a sense, in that we had these pre-adaptations, our lineage would become bipedal apes, were under the threat of lots of predation and the selection pressures that was creating for grouping socially. And then just as that was happening, we entered this period of climate variation on a millennial and submillennial scale. Or are those three factors somehow correlated? Maybe bipedalism was driven by the climate variation in some sense. Maybe apes had to change their foraging strategies because of the forests growing and shrinking or something like that. So how contingent was the evolution of cultural brains?
I think it's really I'd add a bunch of other things.
What would you
to your
add?
list? Well, I think so humans, australopithecines, were bipedal, and that placed constraints on brain size, because as brains get bigger, there's more obstetric complications. And that led to, in early Homo, there seems to have been a shift to a more predatory lifestyle. So now we got apes out on the savanna. They're bipedal. Heads are little, so that's not a problem. Then they start hunting. Females can't hunt with highly dependent offspring. And that leads to changes in social organization and
Cooperative breeding,
cooperative breeding. That's probably potentiates cultural transmission, because there's more individuals together in social groups.
Also, it brings males more firmly into the. So
exactly.
if you're going to have
so males have to provision females,
and
if
fathers have to teach their kids or boys to hunt. And
yeah, so there's a bunch of things, I think, all of which could have gone some other way if it's when I teach this in class, I say it's like little Eliza jumping from one ice flow to another. It's just a bunch of stuff happened, and it ended up where we are, but it didn't have to be that way at all. Yeah.
Wow.
That'd be my story.
Yeah, I would say basically the same thing. So, but if you look at any evolving lineage, look backwards, it's one crazy thing after another. So, horses started as these little forest browsers, and as a climate got drier, more open, then you had a whole revolution, Miocene revolution in mammals. You had the origin of the antelope and bovids and all these efficient grass-eating herbivores that exploited the more open vegetation, browsers that could, if the trees have their leaves way the hell above the ground, then mammals, there are no mammals that get up there very much. But if you've got low trees and shrubs and things, then you got a bunch of browsing specialists that can get after the vegetation. So, and then there are top-down effects of the grazers and the browsers on the ecosystems. And so, if you look back in history, it's just one damn thing after another.
Yeah.
So historical contingency plays a big role.
And that's not opposed to an adaptationist perspective at all, I don't think. I mean, Gould kind of, back in the day, tried to make those, it was, if you're an adaptationist, then you should think you always end up in the same place. And I think there's no reason to think that. Yeah. All selection cares about is now. And so it goes, on the surface, the right had this idea of a adaptive topography, it's got peaks everywhere, and you're just
And
going,
they're
and they're
dynamic.
moving around like the ocean, and you're climbing. Selection is causing lineages to climb as best they can, and where they climb depends on where they are, and so I just I think I don't so this guy at Oxford, what's his name, Simon Conway Morris, isn't he the guy who thinks that if dinosaurs hadn't got extinct, we'd have bipedal big brain dinosaurs, and maybe I doubt it though myself. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that people challenged me about this, I suppose, Rob, too. I mean, if your story's correct, why don't we have lots of animals with big brains and cumulative cultural adaptations? We're all of us are living in the same Pleistocene environment. Why is it just humans that have got this massive?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that has to do with something like, you mentioned it, ape pre-adaptations, where apes are already fairly big-brained. They already have a certain amount of culture, we assume, in the last common ancestor with the living apes. The apes all live in fairly large, fairly sophisticated societies. All of these things you can imagine are potential pre-adaptations. And then we get the australopithecines that are bipedal, and their forelimbs can
Absolutely.
Turn into technology making and technology using devices.
And carrying is a big deal, right? Because you invest in a tool and you're a quadruped, you got to throw it away when, unless you carry it in your mouth, you're done.
Mm.
And whereas, humans could carry a spear around all day. And chimps actually carry stuff like this. Kevin was telling me.
Oh, really? Between the cheek and their shoulders.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
They make sticks and stones they use to crack nuts and stuff. And but they can't carry them very far. It's too inefficient. And I mean, I would think life's like that, right?
That's my picture of evolution, is it's endlessly dynamic. And I mean, there is this picture of evolution that it's the gradual, this progressive idea of evolution, which is, I think, widespread in the public, is that it just took a long time to get humans starting with bacteria, and everybody be a human if they could. Every lineage would have a big brain if they had found a way to get there. This seems to me to be the wrong way to think about it. We have this extremely expensive adaptation that has that evolved in response to these climate variations, and it's not the best adaptation in some absolute sense. It's just something that works in the present day environment.
So I've got some questions about intelligence and artificial intelligence, and then some questions about the fertility crisis. But to start with intelligence, one of the interesting things that's been happening with human brains is that they've been shrinking over the last 10,000 years.
Controversial. The latest paper I saw in that attempted to do the statistical analysis right. There are if I understand it correctly, there are two major problems. One is that there just aren't that many Pleistocene last ice age skulls, and even worse, are very few last ice age postcranial skeletal material. So to correct for bodies, Pleistocene people were probably bigger quite a bit bigger on average, meaty diets, hunting and gatherings, athletic occupation, so they were probably, I think they're known to have been quite a bit bigger, but not just how much is a problem. So those are the statistical difficulties that make it really hard to be sure. So that any difference is pretty slight. So that, I think, is the problem.
Interesting.
And the Pleistocene fossil record is heavily biased to Europe. And Europeans now are the biggest people in the world.
Yeah.
And it's probably a response to cold weather. And so I think you have to be really careful with, what was going on in Southeast Asia or tropical Africa 30 or 40,000 years ago. We have only the slimmest record because those environments don't produce fossils very readily.
They don't produce archaeologists very well.
Well, that's the other thing. There's the croissant effect, which is it's a lot more fun to dig up fossils in southern France than it is in the Congo Basin for lots of archaeologists. And so I read once that there were 50 sites in Europe for every site in sub-Saharan Africa, archaeological sites. So, I would be skeptical of world generalizations about world phenotypes. But go ahead.
It's a good story. It should be true, according to our theory.
According to the cultural brain hypothesis, because culture is substituting for encephalization.
So on the other hand, what has transpired in the Holocene, I think, compared to the last ice age, is people have adapted ever more finely to local ecological variation. So we have all of these agricultural systems that are finely adapted to local environments, and hunting and gathering is a much more generic kind of subsistence strategy that isn't so highly tuned to particular environments. So I think that we in the so to speak, in the Pleistocene, at least in the last ice age, our adaptive effort, so to speak, was mainly adapting to temporal variation, and in the Holocene, it switched to mainly being focused not on the slight temporal variation, but the geographical variation
as we spread across the Earth.
We were already pretty widespread, but except for the Americas until the very end of the Pleistocene. Particularly agricultural crops and animals are pretty sensitive to the local environment, right down to the variety level. So when you adapt to a new environment, you have to adapt your starchy staples, and you have to select for new varieties that will be adapted to the local environment. So that may have had a tendency to keep our brains from atrophying too dramatically.
Our teeth have also gotten much smaller. Over the same time scale.
Because of our addiction to cooking. So if the birth canal is the major constraint on encephalization in humans at the moment, what happens when, so I think in the last couple of decades, cesareans have increased from about 1/4 to 1/3 of births in America, and they've maybe doubled worldwide. Obviously, they still carry a lot of risks. Maybe some even better technology is diffused, like artificial wombs or some, who knows, something like that. What would happen at that point to human brain sizes? Would selection pressures continue to push for for larger and larger brains, or would it break the other way, and because of cumulative culture, the pressure for larger and larger brains is no longer what it was? So if we remove the constraint of the birth canal, what happens to brain sizes?
Well, that's only one constraint. There's a metabolic constraints and the other ones that we talked briefly about earlier, fragility of the skull and things like that. So,
but presumably culture helps us obviate those other...
We're pretty well fed these days in some cultures anyway.
Right.
In some countries. Famously, evolution is not a very successful predictive science. So I think you're asking a very hard question that contingencies will intervene. And even if we knew exactly how we would respond to a particular selective pressure, we would then have to predict the selective pressures, and that is hard to do. I mean, we can make short-term predictions about the evolution of pathogens, for example. COVID is a guy named Paul Ewald. Have you heard his story about this?
I know Paul Ewald, but I don't know his story about COVID.
Well, it wasn't a story about COVID. It was a story about respiratory diseases in general. This was 10 or 15 years ago. He and a student, I don't know, he had a co-author, and they look. The critical variable is how long the infectious agent persists in the environment. If it persists a long time in the environment, then it doesn't have to care very much about the health of the individual that gets sick. So anthrax forms a spore, and so it lives for a very long period of time in the environment, and it's a devastating disease if you catch it. Things like the common cold don't persist in the environment very long, so they have an interest in not harming their host too much. And COVID, the time that COVID spends alive in the environment is, I think, just a little longer than the average flu virus. So the prediction from their model would be that COVID would evolve from being a very virulent disease to one that was much less virulent, something on the order of the seasonal flu, which is more or less what's happened. So those kind of short-term predictions can be quite successful. But and the evolution of certain kinds of adaptations that are tightly constrained by mechanical principles, flying and swimming. You can predict what sort of a pursuit strategy hawks have from the size of and shape of their wings. In other words, if they're maneuvering tightly to catch things in a forested environment, they'll have short, blunt wings. If they're diving from great heights like peregrine falcons in an open environment, they're take a completely different strategy. And so lots of things are predictable, but brain size in humans, I don't know.
And what the selective pressures are.
What the selective pressures will be, yeah.
I mean, you're going to talk about the fertility crisis. It's not clear that, what it is that's driving differences in fitness.
Right.
Whether it's how clever you are or not is I mean.
Interesting. I hadn't made that connection, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, when it is how clever you are, then you might think there'd be the selection gradient would lead to larger brains, and there would be some kind. It depends on everything, right? On energy availability and everything. But in modern societies, at least urban ones, I don't think it's so clear what selection is doing.
Well, I mean, we've all got all these crazy scientists running around publishing papers and neglecting their duties as fathers and mothers. And so
exactly.
So the big brains are leading people to adopt, so to speak, crazy hobbies that detract from their fitness.
Yeah.
Climb mountains are.
Yeah, as you'll be doing next week, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe I'll because we've segued into the fertility crisis, let's talk about that now, and then I'll come back to artificial intelligence after that. So your way of making sense of the demographic transition is one of the most fascinating and compelling that I've encountered in my reading on the topic. Could you outline how you make sense of the demographic transition? And then I'll ask some more specific, sophisticated questions about it.
I think this is your idea, Pete. I think you.
Okay. Well, so that in our 85 book, we have a little vignette about the demographic transition in which we attribute it to basically to careers open to talent, that if education becomes a major source of economic success and prestige, then people who spend a long time furthering their education and start their families late will have an advantage in getting into prestige positions like army officers and teachers and government officials and things like that. So you're sacrificing your genetic fitness for your cultural fitness, so to speak. That is was our basic idea in the 85 book.
And I think that the other thing that's in there is that it has to do with modernization, right?
Yes.
So it's not wealth per se, income that is the key thing. It's the rearrangement of the economy and the society such that prestige roles are required delayed marriage and investment in credentials and stuff. So
the key difference there being you can become prestigious not through birthright but through effort and merit.
But I think that goes. I mean, I wouldn't think about kings and earls and stuff like that. I mean, think about a village in a modernizing society. Who are the prestigious people? You know, the guys that have an outboard on their boat. And I worked in Fiji a little bit, and it's the teacher, it's the local policeman, it's people that have some cash salary. It's not the best farmer in town. That's what it was before. It used to be the guy who could really grow yams better than anybody else. But now
feed six kids
instead of four. Now it's and to get those roles, you have to go to high school. In Fiji, you have to learn English. All these things require investments that are different from the investments in producing kids. And so the data suggests that modernization is a better predictor of the demographic transition than GDP per capita or something like that.
Right. So the former Soviet countries, for example, never got very rich, but they modernized in the sense that education became universal.
Right.
Prestige roles were achieved through education.
Yeah.
So the key change is not so much moving to meritocracy, but it's opening up those channels of non-parental transmission.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, in the old days, it was just the village, right? And now people are going to town sometimes and they're seeing who's in charge there and how cool it is. And I don't think, I mean, these are still highly kin-based. I mean, relatedness still matters for a lot of things, but less than it used to.
Yeah. And, well, my wife, Leslie Newson, you've read part of our book, and her idea is that sort of a generalization of the original argument that we had, I think, is that social networks have changed dramatically. So the proportion of kin and social networks is declining, and the proportion of factory mates, office mates, friends that don't have much interest in your reproductive success. In fact, that might be a handicap on your friendship with the guys you go to the bar with on Saturday night.
Can't buy as many beers.
Those dads that stick at home and don't buy their buddies beers anymore.
Yeah,
we're not going to encourage that kind of behavior.
Yeah.
As Rob says, I think modernization is the sort of master variable here. The switch from subsistence farming or nearly subsistence farming to factory work and office
and
work urban
so
life.
One of the predictions that I would love to see somebody test would be, I'd predict the same thing for urban expansions in the past. So if we could go back to Tenochtitlan or Rome and get good measures of fertility, I'd predict the urban people would get sucked up into the same thing because they have these wider social networks. Prestige networks are,
And I think Rome was really good at just continuing to suck the rural population in.
All those cities were, because they were death traps. But,
so that's partly
that confounds a little bit the
moving to the city was a little bit like a suicide,
but still,
still is to an extent.
I mean, and some of these, they're one of my. I'd like to see somebody. There is demographic data for some of those places.
Yeah,
somebody needs to really.
So it seems to me, Leslie would know better than I, that isn't there some decent data for early modern or medieval Jews in Italy that they underwent a precocious demographic transition that they had?
They'd be exactly who you'd predict.
That would be the kind of people that you would predict. On the other hand, we have these North American Anabaptists that are going after it. I did a back of the envelope calculation once, and I guessed that projecting present demographic parameters, that in about 200 years, half of North Americans will be Anabaptists.
They'll be Mormons instead.
No, the Mormons. I looked at the Mormons when I first got interested in this, and the Mormon demographic transition is
happening.
Is mostly happened by now. My former student, who's a Mormon, observant Mormon, has 3 kids.
2 kids.
What's that?
He has 2 kids.
3 kids.
3 kids.
Adrian, yeah. So he's still a little above the average, but not dramatically.
So one argument about the urban phenomenon is that there's some deep genetically evolved switch in our brains that, once we're surrounded by density and crowds of people, it causes us to downregulate our fertility in response. Does that seem likely to you?
Well, one of the observations that people make of hunter-gatherer subsistence camps is they're tightly crowded together. They don't live.
Interesting.
They don't live miles away from each other. In a given camp, they're tight.
They're often 50 people.
Yeah.
And sort of living in each other's hair, so to speak.
Cheek by jowl.
Denser than the village.
Yeah.
Well,
I guess that largely dispenses with that hypothesis.
Yeah, it depends. They could be averaging. They're quite mobile. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm skeptical of those kind of arguments.
So in your model or your understanding of the demographic transition, there are different cultural forces that are contributing to the spread of the maladaptive, fertility-reducing cultural variant. One being content biases, of which Gary Becker's kind of rational choice model would be a special case.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that prestige bias is the most important cultural force relative to the others?
But we don't know.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to try to actually put numbers on that, because the Leslie's kin influence hypothesis also suggests that when you're having beers with your workmates rather than with your brother, it's not that your workmates have any particular prestige, but they're diluting your social network in people that are interested in your fitness. In other words, your relatives tend to they ask you, geez, you guys should have a kid, shouldn't you? You don't get that you get that thing from grandmothers and mothers and fathers and maybe uncles and brothers and things. You don't get that from your workmates so much. So it isn't necessarily only a prestige thing. So it'd be interesting to try to get a quantitative handle. It might be something you could get a quantitative handle on. Now, the Anabaptists, to take an example where the demographic transition is not happening, they do both things. They seal off the prestige hierarchy that they have their own internal prestige hierarchy, and they seal their prestige system off from the rest of us quite tightly. Things like movies they seal themselves culturally off, and they maintain small communities that are rich in kin. So they are working on both of those things simultaneously.
And some, like the Hutterites, are quite well off.
Well, yeah,
economically well.
Yeah. Well, they have to be economically well off to raise 7 kids
and buy all the property of the kids.
And buy all. Well, the Hutterites actually I've read, so the demographers don't do retail science. They're not like anthropologists. They don't go out there and count heads in the villages. They depend upon government data. But so the actual data on the Anabaptists is quite poor. But I read it said that the Hutterites are actually reducing their fertility some because their style of farming is very modern and requires a huge capital investment. They not only got to buy land, they got to buy tractors and all of the pickup trucks and all of the accoutrements of modern farming, and they have just been growing too rapidly to be able to divide the colony on the time scale that they think is appropriate. So they're scaling back their fertility some, not a lot, but some. So completed family size is more like 5 or 6 than 7, something on that order. The Amish, at least, have gone into wage labor in on a large scale. So what they do is they make a deal with some capitalist entrepreneur that they'll furnish the labor force for some kind of factory. And Amish are, they're pretty skilled people. They grow up on a farm. They can fix machinery and they can build stuff. And so they build things like Winnebagos and other semi-skilled manufacturing jobs that are consistent with their relatively low level of education. So they're and the tourism in some parts of the Amish land, like Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, that is a big absorber of labor. So they've, to some extent, shifted out of the farming business, maybe in part because of land costs, although some of them have moved further west into Ohio and places like that, Illinois, where they can more easily afford the land.
But they still isolate themselves from
the cultural isolation. So the whole deal on these factories is that the entrepreneur will hire only Amish labor. It'll be so that the Amish don't have to mix with non-Amish on the job. The entrepreneur sometimes, I think, is not Amish, but other than that, they don't have to. Their cultural isolation is not threatened on the job.
Right. Yeah, interesting. I read their population, I think, is doubling every 20 years or something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
It'd be interesting to see
completed family
whether
size.
the world's Amish in a few centuries.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other group that's a little like this is the ultra-Orthodox Jews, and they're numerous enough now in Israel to be a political problem or a political force, let's put it that way. So not to prejudge but who knows what, I mean, it's hard to predict what will happen to that whole phenomenon.
But the way that, I just want to focus on the prestige bias story, because I do find this a very powerful explanation. The way it works is, in modern society, to become prestigious, it often helps to have fewer kids, because then you can extend your education, focus more of your time and efforts on career advancement. And the people who become prestigious are the people who are most likely to be imitated. And so in modernity, the people being imitated happen to be people who typically have fewer children than in pre-modern societies. Just so I'm clear, is the imitation happening for reduced fertility per se, or is it more happening for the package of behaviors that produce success, of which reduced fertility is a byproduct?
I'd bet with number two.
Byproduct, yeah, that's certainly the argument we made in the 85 book. And
interesting, because at least today, anecdotally, if I speak to, female friends, they'll tell me that there is a sense that having lots of kids early is uncool, or calling it socially taboo is probably pushing it too far. But it does seem like there has also been a norm that's kind of congealed around having less kids per se, in addition to the package of things that lead to career success.
Yeah, especially in East Asians seem to have carried this to Koreans. So I think Korea has maybe the lowest or one of the lowest TFRs in the world, I think. It's
down to like 1 point something.
Or even below 1, I think.
Sorry, I think it might be 0.9 even.
Yeah, that's what my recollection is. So, I mean, again, there's the prestige angle, and then there's then there's the social network effect, and those two are partly decoupled. So they're both effects are operating in the same direction,
and things get turned into norms. I mean, I don't know if this is so. There's quite a bit of evidence that people just look around and they say, "What's everybody doing?" So that must be the right thing to do, and so common behaviors become moralized or prestigized. And there's, guys like Granovetter, and there's a bunch of sociologists that have unmotivated empirical data that suggests that's, they don't start from where we're starting. They just.
I notice this in myself. Somebody tells me that they have 5 kids, and I go,
yeah. You think, wow, that's
weird.
a lot. Yeah.
So the data on things like are, so if you tell kids, oh, you shouldn't drink, drinking's bad, that has no effect. But if you tell kids nobody's drinking, that has a big effect on people. Have done experiments, and there's a bunch of pluralistic ignorance. So everybody, well, not everybody, but the average kid on college campus thinks that other people are having a lot more fun than they are and are drinking more and having more sex and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So if you tell people what's actually going on, it motivates them
to drink less.
And
maybe the process starts with model-based transmission, and then conformist bias puts the final nail in the coffin.
There's conformist bias too.
Right?
And conformist bias would just make it more common, but I think we haven't ever written anything about this, but I mean, a good general rule would be if you're a little kid and you're growing up, if everybody's doing something, it must be, that must be what we're supposed to do around here.
Yeah. Just in a Bayesian sense.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I've got 3 more questions on the fertility crisis.
Okay.
I think these are even the most important questions. So, a few disturbing facts. The demographic transition began in the West about 1870, but obviously it happened unevenly across countries. As far as I know, no Western country has reversed its demographic transition.
I believe that's true, yes.
Moreover, fertility declines have also penetrated into the lower socioeconomic levels of society within Western countries. And then in addition, lots of non-Western countries have begun their demographic transitions.
Almost all.
China and India are below replacement. You mentioned South Korea, Vietnam, bunch of countries in South America.
Just not Africa.
Sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, Africa seems largely unaffected at this stage.
I'm not sure that's true. It's the data I've seen suggests that it's proceeding much more slowly in Africa than it has. It proceeded very rapidly in East Asia, but it's very slow, or if not stalled, in sub-Saharan parts of sub-Saharan Africa.
Is much slower in sub-Saharan Africa too.
Right.
Yeah.
So, does the fact that fertility reducing behaviors don't seem to be being fixed very quickly imply that cultural group selection has weakened and that we have low variation?
Why would cultural group selection favor larger families? That's the assumption behind that question.
Maybe there's a different path into the question. I think the assumption is, if this isn't being fixed quickly, does that imply that we're in some kind of global macro culture?
I'm sorry? Oh, I see.
I guess the archetype is like the Davos-style elite, but because we're all interconnected through telecommunications technologies.
Yeah. Well, we do have a macro culture in the sense that urban life, bureaucratic government,
Hollywood movies,
educational systems that take a lot of time.
Yeah,
that's shared more or less to varying degrees across the world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, development agencies are trying as hard as they can to make everybody else do it too.
Yeah.
So,
so am I making an analytical error? I mean, could we infer from the fact that the demographic transition isn't being fixed in all these different countries that cultural evolution is happening too slowly, and therefore there must be low variation?
The trouble is, you mentioned non-parental transmission. So culture in lots of cases will result in adaptations that would fix problems with genetic fitness, but that's not guaranteed at all. So cultural evolution can favor fitness diminishing behavior. Selection on cultural variation will not necessarily be correlated with selection on genetic fitness.
For sure.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, globally, overall in human evolution, it had to have been true that there was some kind of correlation between cultural fitness and genetic fitness, or else culture wouldn't have evolved, right? It would have been extinguished by selection. But
But that doesn't have to have been true for even the last 10,000 years.
No,
I mean,
exactly.
especially if you think brains are getting smaller. I mean,
so
I don't see any clear reason to predict that cultural evolution should favor higher genetic fitness, except that our brains have evolved to, we like sweet things and we don't want to die, and lots of fitness enhancing things. But if cultural evolution has finessed that by creating prestige systems, I don't see any reason it can't persist.
Might persist to extinction of humans.
Well, I mean, there's all these, there's the so-called Irish elk case, which is probably not true, but sexual selection can lead to ridiculous ornaments that reduce average fitness.
Right, like the peacock's tail is the classic example.
In theory. I don't think there are actually good examples of this, but and the classic example is the Irish elk, which is this extinct species of elk that had these, truly enormous antlers. And some people have, but I don't, they're long gone and who knows. But lots of animals became extinct at the end of the Pleistocene.
Mostly at the end of a spear, I imagine. But.
Yeah. So anyway, I just don't.
So on the other hand, if you want to think about the Anabaptists, the correction is going right along, right?
But
it only take as
long as they can remain insular.
And that much more powerful, technologically much more powerful. I mean, may happen in Israel, right? That secular Israelis will get tired of this and squash them. And
so that's one scenario. That
who knows? I mean,
who knows? But yes, I don't think there's any law-like process that will force a strong correlation between cultural fitness and genetic fitness. And,
for sure.
And there I think important weak forces. So I think of the emotional system, for example, as being the main sort of corrector. Appetites and emotions. You mentioned food.
Kids. I mean, people love kids.
Yeah, people do love kids. We love our kids.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not so many of them, but. Most people who have kids will tell you it's the most important thing they ever did, even if they're only had a couple. So
if selection created a mechanism where you can get a lot of satisfaction from two kids, then it won't work very well. Might have worked fine when there was natural fertility, but it doesn't work anymore. And
we got a lot of people in the world, and so we got a lot of scope for something happening before we go extinct.
Right. Yeah. So there is indeed some variation. There are also a lot of projections that show global population peaking around. There's a UN projection that shows it peaking
late-ish
around
in this century,
2080.
Yeah.
How much does that worry you from the perspective of we need a large and increasing cultural brain, collective brain rather, in order to sustain a technologically advanced civilization? I know, Rob, you did some work on fishing technologies in Oceania, and the islands that were more populous and better connected had a greater number of fishing technology types and more complex fishing technologies.
That's all true.
There's also obviously the salutary lesson of the Tasmanian Aborigines in Australia when the sea levels rose and
isolated,
cut them off from the mainland, fully isolated them about 8,000 years ago. They slowly lost their technologies. By the time Europeans encountered them, they had a toolkit of about 24 tools, which is the smallest toolkit in human history.
No boats.
Yeah. And
no tailored clothing.
As an interesting, control, as a natural experiment, just across the Bass Strait, when the local Aboriginal clan or tribe there was when European contact was made with them, they had like hundreds of tools in their toolkit. So to the extent that we need a really large collective brain to sustain technologically advanced civilization, fertility declines worry, or I guess we're recording this today in the Internet Archive headquarters. Now that we've digitized so much of culture, is that like a countervailing force, or how do you think about that problem?
And institutional, I mean, now in the last, when we talked about science a bit earlier, but we now have institutions for innovating and cultural evolution that are evolving on their own. You know, the engine of scientific and engineering progress, I don't think depends so heavily on population size as the diffuse, informal processes of innovation that happen in the village, right? So,
and so things like things like formal education have the effect of greatly increasing the exposure of any given individual to cultural ideas, particularly with regard to things like technology. So somebody who's got a double E degree or a computer science degree has been exposed to a huge amount of technical knowledge that they'd never pick up without formal
and much
education.
more efficiently than so.
Or at least that's what we college professors claim.
Pardon?
It's what we college professors claim.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Some people are skeptical.
ASU is trying to measure what kids actually learn. Seems like a bad idea to me.
But I'd like what you find out.
I don't know. The other thing is the models, Joe's model and the Shannon.
Joe Henrich
has of this, what he calls the treadmill model of this, and Steve Shannon and Mark Thomas and those guys had a more like a drift-based, a random loss model. Joe's, well, it doesn't matter. The point is they both show very striking diminishing returns. So you get a big effect for when populations go from 100 to 1,000, a smaller effect, 1,000 to 10,000.
Oh, interesting.
And we saw that so those plots you see in our data are on log scales.
Oh, okay.
And if you actually plot them out in, linear scales, they nose over because the sampling. They're both based on sampling, so that Joe's model works. You learn something, but as we know, students don't learn everything from their teachers, so things tend to go backwards a little bit through each cultural transmission process. But it's just like the experiment I talked about earlier. That's exactly like the experiment I talked about earlier. By copying the most successful people, that brings the mean back up again, and there's some balance. And actually,
there's a square root of n factor in the models, literally.
So Joe's model is very stylized, and it has a threshold, and either technology goes off to infinity or it goes to zero. But if you put in, it takes longer to learn more complicated things. So Alex Masudi modified the model in that way, and it shows it shows diminishing returns, just like you'd think. So to population size, and so I think 10 billion is a lot of people. And, if we were down at 100,000, I would be more worried. But
Interesting.
And then couple that with the fact that we've made the system much more efficient by routinizing it and institutionalizing it and made it less sensitive, I think, to these diminishing returns kinds of things. I mean, I think specialized institutions where incentives have been norms and incentives have evolved to create more efficient accumulation of knowledge, that has a big effect, obviously.
So in my own scientific practice, the availability of scientific literature on the internet has been a big revolution to me. I mean, I can read far more papers if I can harvest them off the internet than I have to traipse down to the library and
the proof of that
photocopy
is
them. And
the citation rate of articles and books.
yeah,
Really?
because
you
they
can't
haven't
grab
solved
them
the
off the internet, whereas
Interesting.
journal articles,
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So, a couple of questions about artificial intelligence. Does your understanding of how human intelligence evolved give you any unique insights into how artificial intelligence might be created?
Well, I attended a conference on AI about 6 weeks ago or so, and so I boned up just a little bit. And Alison Gopnik, do you know who she is? She's a developmental psychologist here at Berkeley, and she argues in a paper that that artificial intelligence has nailed culture. That artificial intelligence is these large language models have made the accumulated wisdom of the world available in a very efficient way. Now it's also made the bullshit factor in culture equally exaggerated, right? So it's easy to get. That's why the large language models have these flaws, is because they're tapping into the craziness of culture as well as the sensible fraction of it. And she argues that we also have learning models, right? Individual like learning models, models of innovation, but those aren't integrated with the large language models. And the kinds of success-based filters that we think are so important in making culture adaptive, it's not clear that they're built into the current thinking on AI. And other people make the point that AI has this problem that it's computationally extremely expensive. So if we say that with Gopnik that AI has aced the cultural part of it, what about the cultural transmission kind of part of it?
Yeah.
What about the innovative part of it? What about the quality filters part of it? Can we integrate those into AI without making it prohibitively expensive?
Yeah.
Very unschooled thoughts.
Interesting nonetheless. Do you have anything to add to that?
AI will be cultural.
Yeah.
It's got to be, but how it'll all work is a mystery to me.
Yeah. One thing I was contemplating was a lot. I think the modal scenario for a lot of people is you basically have billions of copies of AGI agents. For example, if we create AGI, and presumably they will all be interacting both with each other and with humans, and presumably they will be participating in our cultural evolution. But what's interesting is that they might have different, like the forces of cultural evolution might change in that scenario. So presumably they will have less transmission bias than humans.
Well, it
and
depends
perhaps
how their learning psychology gets, how
and
that
teaching
evolves.
psychology
Teaching
work.
psychology is, are they teaching each other, or are people teaching them? I mean, who knows? I mean, I mean, it could easily be very, they look around and see which bot is the most successful and copy that one. It could be.
Yeah.
You should read Allison's paper. She's kind of a wicked lady.
Oh, she's a smart one. Allison.
Yeah, she is.
And the guy I mentioned earlier, Bill Thompson's part of the same
group,
intellectual stream. Yeah, and also at Berkeley. And there's a whole bunch of those guys that are
So Allison is a child development person. So she argues you're trying to replicate babies, and babies are already a much more efficient way of doing this than server farms burning fossil fuel till it, as if it were not causing any real problems.
Right.
And so that's why I say she's got a little wicked sense of humor. You might enjoy that paper.
Yeah. She's got a great book about child development from a cognitive point of view with Laura Schultz. And it's written, the great part of the book, it's a bunch of papers too, but the great part of the book is this long intro that she and Laura wrote in the form of an email exchange between, so it's like a dialogue, right? Between a mathematical cognitive scientist and a, experimental child development person like Allison. And it's great. I mean, highly recommended. Yeah.
Well, I'll check it out.
Yeah.
I don't know that.
Yeah.
Thanks for the recommendation.
She's a good one.
So I have a million more questions for you guys, which is obviously an indication of just how interesting and rich your work is. But we are running out of time. We're about to get kicked out of this beautiful room that we're recording in. So my final question is, you two for me are a very successful scientific dyad. And there are many interesting examples of other scientific dyads, Watson and Crick being a famous one, Marie and Pierre Curie. There seems to be something special about the number 2 that in certain contexts is perhaps more productive than either lone researchers or group sizes of 3 or more.
Yeah.
And firstly, I'd like to just invite you to speculate on why that might be from an evolutionary perspective. Like, is it maybe piggybacking on pair bonding, or is it a culturally evolved institution, the scientific dyad? And then secondly, I'd like to understand how each of you thinks about the other's comparative advantage in your scientific partnership. So Pete, how you think about Rob's comparative advantage, and Rob, how you think about Pete's comparative advantage.
I think we're friends, right? That's the
Forever.
have been for 50 years.
Yeah, 50 years.
And 50.
Actually, 54 years.
So
Bill Hamilton's living room.
Yeah, right.
You met in Bill Hamilton's living room?
No, different Bill Hamilton.
Different Davis Bill Hamilton.
Oh, not
Rob was a
okay.
Rob was a first-year graduate student the year I was a first-year
1970.
faculty member, and we met at a seminar at this eccentric professor's house.
This is high 70s. Orange shag carpet, conversation pit, the whole 9 yards.
And well, Bill Hamilton's another whole story, but I think that's we enjoy each other's company, and I think that's the main thing that I mean, we have this great project that we put together, but we could. I mean, it'd be easy to feel resentful that Rob got more credit than I did, or vice versa, and some both of us have a certain eccentricities that would, in a different context, lead to resentments or God, I'm tired of this son of a bitch. But we never went that way, so I think that is really important.
I don't think it's maybe it's evolution in some deep sense, but I think increasing the number of collaborators increases the diversity of skills and knowledge, and that's very beneficial. And we're going to talk about that in a second, I guess. But the bigger you get, the more the free rider problem raises its head, and that that people get lazy, people want credit, all those kinds of things. And two may be somehow in the sweet spot between.
Well, if someone's not pulling their weight in a partnership, you know who it is.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas if it's even 3 or 4, then I mean, I've projects and stuff.
Both of us have participated in far larger projects.
Yeah,
quite
people
productive ones.
Goof off and stuff. So there's that. And I guess I'll start on the second part of your question, which is we bring, I think, somewhat different, complementary, but overlapping, but quite different skills. I'm more of a modeler, and Pete knows more than anybody I've ever met about everything, and at least everything important. Maybe not who wrote what poem, but science, and especially the more environmental kinds of how the world works, science. And I think bringing those two skills together was quite productive.
Yeah, I agree with that. When I had a friend in graduate school who was a quite accomplished population geneticist. He's in the National Academy by now. And so when I got interested in cultural evolution, I knew my math skills were not up to, not without a hell of a lot of work, were not up to what was required. So that's one of the reasons I first tried to interest Rob in this project. That it wasn't a project in the beginning. I was just looking for material for one lecture, and it turned into a project.
Yeah, Cavalli, Schwartz, and Feldman.
Yep.
So,
so then it turned out that Rob's a hell of a good scientist. He thinks like a scientist is supposed to think. He's skeptical when he needs to be skeptical, and never takes any bullshit off anybody. So,
it's just, people are complicated, and the fit was good, I think. And then by chance, I think we had a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's
the main.
That is, I just stumbled on this.
Yeah,
thing.
exactly.
And you could just see when we started talking about this, you could just see there's all this low-hanging fruit. The population geneticists and the evolutionary biologists were 75 years ahead of the social scientists in this business of what a cultural adaptation was. They were in the 19th century.
But they weren't, they were, there's this, they decided they weren't going to talk about people. I mean, that's one of the things in
the evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
So the evolutionary
and the population geneticists don't talk about adaptations very much.
The evolutionary biologists who do talk about adaptations were in the thrall of the modern synthesis. I think they couldn't imagine that they needed anything fundamental besides genes as an information carrier. They could see that culture could do some things, but the idea that it could be a fundamental force in human evolution was just beyond them.
Still plenty of geneticists and evolutionary biologists who think that way, but it's changing. I mean, the cultural evolution is getting. When we started, it was like chariots of the gods, right? I mean, it was crazy talk. What do you mean cultural evolution? And now it's you see it all the time. I mean, PNAS is having a big 50-year celebration about 50 years of cultural evolution coming around on the guitar. So I don't know. It's been a big success. And
that's really cool.
Fun.
Yeah.
When you were talking about your complementarities, Rob, you mentioned that Pete has this encyclopedic knowledge and you have more of the mathematical.
I don't think it's so much. I mean, I'm only a mediocre mathematician. I have some skill at figuring out how to make simple models of things that are
the way someone described it to me was that in the partnership, Pete brings the variation and Rob brings the selection.
That's, I think, I've actually said that myself. So
right.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I have a speculative tendency.
Well,
it can sometimes get out of control.
Served you well. It served you well. Well, it's been a great pleasure speaking with both of you today. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Okay, I've certainly enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's fun.
Thank you. Done.
Okay.